Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast. Very nice to be with you. My name is Cameron English, joined by my daughter in the background, and of course, Dr. Liza Dunn. Liza, what's going on?
Not much. How are you? Been traveling all over the place.
I'm terrific. I don't know how you do your travel. That's insane. You're in Dubai, then you're in the Midwest, then you're in wherever. So goodness.
It keeps me on my toes.
Yes.
That's exactly what I say.
Yeah. If you hear my daughter chime in every once in a while, everyone, that's because the daycare lady is sick, so my kids are running around, so they're going to get a science lesson too. So we'll proceed as uninterrupted as possible. 3 stories as always. We're going to break these down, which we haven't done in a while. I'm actually kind of thrilled to get back to this. Okay, first up, what will humans be like generations from now in a world transformed by artificial intelligence? Next up, NPR and hypocrisy on science. It defends Girl Scout cookies under attack from the MAGA right after years of promoting crackpot chemophobia. And finally, sending science backward. MAGA fuels a culture war against life-saving mRNA vaccines. Lots of MAGA in the headlines this week.
I know, right?
This first story, I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on because it's largely speculative, as the author admits. This is originally from the Conversations authored by Rob Brooks, who I believe is an evolutionary biologist in Sydney. Evolution and Ecology Research Center, spelled the sexy European way with the R-E. I'm curious to get your thoughts, Liza. I mean, I think because AI is, immediately going to have a profound impact on healthcare. It probably already is in some ways. But he's talking here about how our interactions with AI are going to increase, and they may actually shift human evolution over a long period of time. He's not saying next week or 2 years, but over time, this could profoundly, change how we interact with one another, how we interact with computers. And he doesn't really speculate on whether this is good or bad. He's just sort of throwing the idea out there as something to think about. We've talked a little bit about this. Some of it horrifies me, frankly. Some of it is extremely useful already. Speaking of things like Grok and ChatGPT, and that as well, high-powered microphones that can pick up babies. I don't know if that's AI. That's not AI, but anyways, I'm curious to get your thoughts. What did you take away from this?
Yeah, I think AI is here for better or for worse, and it's here to stay. And I think that there are going to be some good things and there's going to be some bad things about it. One of the good things about it is that you can probably really transform the rate at which you do kind of exploratory work. So for drug development, when you're looking at different proteins and the way they fold and things like that, that'll probably very much expedite those kinds of things, and expedite rote kinds of things. In terms of what's it going to do for medicine, I think that's a much trickier topic. I think that there have been many attempts to sort of compartmentalize medicine and have computers take over. A lot of tech bros seem to think that computers will be able to replace doctors and doctors' diagnostic acumen and things like that. I think that that's not the case because there is the art of medicine that goes with that. So I'm not sure that medicine's going to be as impacted as people think it will. And there's a lot when you're doing a differential diagnosis, often there's everything from a cold to cancer diagnosis in there. So you're opening it up to patients like that it's like Dr. Google, right? It makes patients very, very anxious. So those are the immediate things. But in terms of evolving alongside, I think evolution is real. And I think that if you are not engaging with people because you're just engaging with a computer or an AI avatar kind of thing, you might not have children. And that to me is probably the most immediate impact if you're being moved away from your social circles because you're not interacting with real people anymore. I think that could be detrimental. In terms of, he talks about how the dog became domesticated from the wolf over millennia. I'm not sure it's going to have that kind of effect, but I do think it's really going to impact our social interactions.
He gets close to talking about this in one of the paragraphs. He says that if AI learns to capture user attention ever more effectively, stoking anger and fomenting social comparison, the consequences for who lives, dies, and reproduces will affect evolution. In the best of a series of bleak scenarios, the ability to resist social media or remain unmoved by rage bait might evolve to be stronger. That's a really interesting thing. What freaks me out is that we already know that there are millions of young men who their first introduction to sex is pornography. Whether you think that's a good or bad thing is a different discussion. I'm horrified by it.
I am too.
The biggest thing that's troubling about it is that it keeps a lot of men out of the dating market because that natural biological drive to reproduce, which encourages you to find a girlfriend or a wife or whatever, that's eliminated for a lot of people. So you have fewer people getting married and starting families, which means you have fewer people, which you need for a civilization. Without people,
That's right.
This is troublesome. And the impacts for men are bad, but then for there's a lot of women. I see this all the time on social media. They're saying, I just want to get married and I want to have a family, and I can't find anybody that I have reasonable standards, right? I don't need to like marry Ryan Gosling, but like just a normal dude who can provide for a family, right? I see that all the time, and that's really concerning.
Yes.
So maybe over the long term there are going to be some profound consequences on an evolutionary timescale, but I'm almost afraid that we might not get to those because the consequence. And again, maybe I'm being super crazy, and this is an AI sci-fi kind of a horror story I'm painting. But
On the other hand, you may be able to. I mean, I've met more people in the past decade than ever who have gotten married because they've met online. And so if you have an algorithm that actually can pick up some very unique things about you, they might be able to match you up with somebody who can, be just as unique and interesting and things like that. However, I do think that the algorithm winds up, weeding out people that you might like, if based on political views or religious views or things like that. So trying to completely sort of control everything makes you lose some of the magic, right? And it makes you lose learning how to negotiate with people who disagree with you or who are different than you. Trying to tweak things to such a degree for people who meet, I think you miss out on some very important diplomatic skills.
It's a great point. And he goes on and talks a little bit about how we start to shift our intimacy from other people into AI, which you were just touching on. But it's fascinating because I've learned to use Grok very effectively for a lot of the work that I do. For like scut work and like basic research, I'll be like, hey, what does the latest research say about whatever topic? And then I'll go from there, and
then it'll point you in that direction.
It's very useful. But I remember, just for fun, I remember one time recently, I was like, I get really bad canker sores. What do I do about that? And it just spit out within 30 seconds like a bunch of detailed stuff, and said, next time you're at your doctor's office, ask about this medicine and do this, and gargle with this. And I was like, hey, thanks, that was super helpful. And it responded as a person would, like, hey, I'm here to serve. Let's get the sting out of your mouth, or some kind of pun or something.
But I
could recognize in myself. I enjoyed this interaction, but I went, that's weird because this is just
it's a machine,
right? It's a digital brain that just has a bunch of training data that it's recycling. So I could see for someone who's not, and not to paint myself as this above it all person, but for a younger kid who's struggling with mental health or something, I could see this being really, really troubling.
Yep. But in a way, it could be good too, because it could help you with your loneliness. So there's a mix there. There are kids that I think are very lonely in their friend groups, and they get bullied and things like that. So it might help them have a support system in some capacity as well. So I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah, there's only trade-offs. I think that's a good point. Maybe if it's used, and I've heard people, I think you've said this too, like if it's used in medicine, it's directed by a physician or it's directed by a healthcare practitioner, then it could be very effective. And maybe in that setting too, right? If you can use AI to help people acquire the skills that they're going to need.
Yep.
If you're in a basic conversation, here's what you say, here's what you
That's
don't
right.
say. If you're in an interview, this is what you're likely to be at, like that kind of thing. Or you're struggling with loneliness, here's how you
Yep.
got here. You know what I mean? Like it could be enormously effective. But what I've seen in a lot of media reports on this, and we talked about one from the BBC where they said, oh, well, you're cripplingly depressed and you're stuck in your apartment. Well, just talk to this thing. It's going to learn about you. And then
It's going to suggest that you
yeah,
off yourself, which
yeah,
is
yeah. And then
not good.
That's horrible. But then over time, they were speculating that pretty soon it could take the shape of whoever you're interacting with. So, you're giving all this information to this computer
Yes.
program, and then pretty soon the technology will be able to create a digital image and actually
Yes.
interact with you like a conversation. And then pretty soon you're at a show like Black Mirror where, your husband dies and then the computer just effectively reconstitutes your deceased
Your
husband,
husband.
and I'm like,
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of creepy.
yeah. Anyways, so this is an interesting article. Go check it out. It's at The Conversation. GLP reprinted it. It's called "What Will Humans Be Like Generations from Now in a World Transformed by Artificial Intelligence." I won't be here, and that makes me glad, to be honest.
Me too. Me neither.
Okay. Okay, moving on here. Let's talk about my favorite topic, which is the media being full of hypocrites
Right?
who drive me insane. This is originally from Dr. David Zarek's website called The Firebreak. Great resource.
Great
On
resource. Everybody
science.
should go sign up for that.
Yes, you can subscribe for free, but if you want to do a paid subscription, you can do that as well. It's like $5 or something. Anyways, it's great, and there's a lot of useful content like this article, NPR and Hypocrisy on Science. It defends Girl Scout cookies under attack from the MAGA right after years of promoting crackpot chemophobia. So the basic idea here is that NPR came out a couple weeks back and they published a story. This is from April 1 called "Crumbling Trust in American Institutions. A MAHA Activist Takes on Girl Scout Cookies." The story is about Zen Honeycutt. She runs a group called Moms Across America, which is a collective of nutty people who believe very strange things, including that Thin Mints are toxic and you shouldn't eat them. Now, to their credit, NPR came out and they spoke to a toxicologist. And they said,
Finally.
yeah, right, right. And, the scientists correctly said, because the idea is there's heavy metals in cookies, in these cookies, of course, because grains grow out of the ground. There's mercury and arsenic and lead and so forth in tiny quantities in the ground, in the soil.
In the ground. Mm-hmm.
And so almost any food, any pre-prepared food, probably any food, actually, if you were to test it for heavy metals, you'd find some. But so they quote this toxicologist who says you'd have to eat 73,000 cookies in a day, roughly a warehouse's worth, to flirt with any semblance of danger. Okay, so they're right about that. But the article goes on to explain that NPR has this enormously detailed history of promoting chemical scares. If you look at their coverage of glyphosate, it promotes all the tropes. It downplays the scientific consensus around the safety of that chemistry. Hilariously, they actually attacked Girl Scout cookies in 2023. So not in 1987, but in 2023, less than 2 years after or before they published this. And they were lamenting the use of palm oil as a cause of deforestation. And they were talking about how these sugary cookies are hooking people on ultra-processed food, right?
Exactly.
Now,
and that whole sugar is addictive kind of thing.
Yeah. So take it away here. What did you take out of this? I thought it was both helpful and infuriating.
Well, so it's the same thing as the same thing that happened with the COVID vaccine. So you had the groups on the left when Trump brought Operation Warp Speed to the forefront, and all of a sudden we had these really incredible scientific discoveries, right? And the left, because they can't stand MAGA, was like, no, there's not been enough research on this. This is way too fast. This is bad. This is bad. This is bad. And then when the vaccines were available, they were all of a sudden like, oh no, these are the most wonderful things in the entire world, and you absolutely have to take them, and you better not ask us any questions, because if you do ask us questions, you're MAGA. And they've done the same thing. The same thing out of a lot of these universities have done the same thing with plastic, with trace pesticides, with aspartame, with all sorts of different, with sugar, all of this, uh, writing epidemiologic articles making claims that there are associations between certain exposures, trace exposures of BPA, for example, and in outcomes in patients that are not supported by the science, but have been very hyped up by the mainstream media, and it's being fed by this group. And then when it turns out that it happens on the right, then all of a sudden they find science again. And so this is why I really the politicization of science is really detrimental to the truth, because it seems like whatever their popular cause is, as long as MAGA is on the opposite side, then they'll stick with it. But they seem to shift their perceptions whenever, and that may be true of the right too. They're so polarized that they can't see the forest for the trees or the truth about anything. And so now we're in a big loop where you've got the extreme left and the extreme right meeting in the middle in the shape of RFK Jr., who's actively trying to get rid of fluoride, and who's actively trying to, ban sugar, and doing all of the stuff that that NPR advocated for in the past. And now they're going, oh, well, maybe we should have just stuck with the scientific method. So it's frustrating.
It is. I want you to talk while I cater to my child's needs. There's an example in here just from last year, in fact, where NPR was going on about cosmetics causing endocrine disruption. This is like one of the go-to boogeyman greatest hits of the anti-chemical movement. Talk about that and why that in particular is disingenuous for NPR to push.
Well, specifically because, NPR and other organizations who tend to lean left have been calling out all sorts of chemistries over decades and saying that they're responsible for endocrine disruption in small doses. And they say that what the endocrine disruption leads to is harm in children, and harm in the environment. Because it makes it, according to who is it, RFK Jr., makes frogs gay. No, Alex Jones makes frogs gay. All of this kind of stuff. So they're making these claims that trace exposures to different things, everything from plastic to any kind of chemical that they find disturbing, is harming the endocrine system and causing premature puberty, infertility, all of these kinds of things. At the same time, these groups will then advocate for gender affirming care in children. And what that involves the administration of puberty blockers. That involves, which definitely disrupt. They are puberty blockers. They're disrupting normal puberty. They advocate for the use of cross-sex hormones in gender dysphoric children. And this results in infertility, permanent infertility, and anatomical issues for kids as well. So my concern is that and this is coming from not just NPR, but people, and they're saying it's a human rights issue. This is not a human rights issue. This is a medical. This is, quite frankly, medical malpractice. Unless you have the case of a very rare, disorder of development, right, where you've got hermaphroditism and you're not, undetermined sex. That's incredibly rare circumstances. But to advocate for giving normal kids who are confused or have a mental health issue or are anxious, to advocate for giving those kinds of treatments to those kids, and then to say it's so harmful that you have to ban plastic, it's completely does not make any sense. And I think we're going to reflect back on this time and wonder how so many people fell into this kind of lunatic fringe. It's really insane.
Yeah, the herd mentality is strong. I think that's probably most of it. Is that when all the sophisticates in your life, all the cool kids say something, you go, "Oh, okay, guess this is what the cool kids are doing." Um, the one criticism I've heard on that issue specifically is that, well, in those cases, the drugs are administered by a physician and they're given under supervision and blah, blah, blah. Now, in the case of endocrine disruption from cosmetics or food or whatever, people eat cookies assuming they're safe because they're on the grocery store shelf. And if there is harm, it's unintentional. And my response was always, well, intentionality matters, but so does the actual thing you're doing. So if you
That's right.
do something with a good intention and it harms somebody, then I could not care less about your intentions. And then, of course, cookies don't disrupt your endocrine system. Cosmetics
No,
don't.
no, they don't.
Nothing that the NGOs, like environmental working groups, say is an endocrine disruptor is actually an endocrine disruptor.
And there is testing that is done, especially if there's a concern that's raised. That once again, a bunch of taxpayer dollars are paid, are going towards examining perfectly safe things. And so it's frustrating. It's frustrating. The other thing that really bothers me about this is that this goes along with the whole kind of sugar is addictive and you need sugar for life. Glucose is the thing that you need that feeds your cells. And yes, you can have proteins and fats and stuff like that, but glucose is the thing that you need, right? So sugar is one of the building blocks of life. And yes, if you eat too many Girl Scout cookies, you'll get chubby. You could get diabetes, and you could have consequences for being sedentary and eating too much. But it's not because you're addicted to them. It's just the way the physiology works. And I think that the tobacconization of absolutely everything it really plays into this fear mongering, and it also negatively impacts companies that make good stuff. The Girl Scouts is objectively good. They help girls learn how to build a skill set, build confidence. It's objectively good. And so to say that they're doing things that are evil, it's not, it's destructive.
Yeah, they have beclowned themselves, to use a
Mm-hmm.
popular phrase. The activists, this is just beyond the pale, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing with NPR that's just so ridiculous is that, well, I know, I agree, sweetheart. Everything about them is ridiculous, but the cynicism or the capability really to partition your thinking this way, it's really fantastic to me that you're able to, because I don't think most people at NPR are going, okay, now we're going to change our stance on this
No.
because it's popular to do so. But the fact that they're like, I couldn't do that. I couldn't look back because I know generally what I've written over the years, and if I all of a sudden came out and said, well, you should, sugar's addictive,
Yeah.
I would be like, well, I know that's not. I've written enough about that, so I couldn't come out in good conscience and say, okay, I'm gonna write this now.
No.
It's a crazy
right.
mindset.
And that's what if you are objectively trying to arrive at the truth, you will stay consistent, right? And I guess science changes. There are things that evolve over time with a new technology. But if you've got 50 years of history, you kind of know it just is. And so I think that once again, politics has got to get out of science.
It never will. I think the best we can hope for is that everyone lays their cards on the table
That's right.
and says, this is what I think. Nevertheless, I'm going to do my best to arrive at the truth.
Yep.
You can think differently, and then we will check each other, right? We will act as a check and a balance.
Check and a balance. That's right. Yeah.
But what so often happens, we'll talk about this in the next story as we transition here, is that people will complain about partisanship in science, and then they will look at all of their opponents and they'll say, yeah, those partisans over there, those people that I happen to disagree with, they're the problem because they're bringing their partisan politics into the discussion, right?
And what's really interesting about that is if you have somebody who doesn't align with either side, they've got issues, they've got issues with that don't align with the left or the right in certain departments, then you kind of know that they're probably actually open-minded and thinking about the truth because they aren't wedded to being part of the crowd. Does that make sense? Um, people on the right are now anti-vaccine, a lot of them, but they're also anti and people on the left are all this pro gender affirming care in children. And if you are pro vaccine, that doesn't mean you're necessarily pro gender affirming care in children. And so I think that if you find people who are willing to disagree with the party line of their supposed political bent, then you can actually have some, at least they're looking for the truth.
I'll give you one example as we move on to this story from Bloomberg about mRNA vaccines. This is from my colleague, Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein of the American Council on Science and Health. He pointed out that, there's this hubbub about a measles outbreak in Texas, which is true. Get the measles vaccine. It's good for you. But one of the points he made is that some of the people who are contracting measles now, they're part of a Mennonite community that's originally from Mexico. But they're not, as far as I know, they're not Hispanic, right? So they don't fit into the typical immigration debate.
That's right.
But they also don't fit into the kooky RFK, right? Like, it's not that RFK came in and this outbreak happened. It's that these people are from a community. They're like Amish adjacent is the way to think about it. And they typically reject vaccines and other medical interventions. And no one wants to talk about that because it doesn't fit into their predetermined template about what you're supposed to say about vaccines, right? And this is one of my frustrations with people that lean to the left of center people, right? Is they will talk, see, hi there. They will talk about the importance of vaccinating your kids, but they will at the same time advocate for a pretty lax immigration policy where you're bringing people in and you don't know their vaccination status.
That's right.
So, and again, I'm not talking about immigration. That's a different subject. But if you're so concerned about community transmission of a deadly virus, then why all of a sudden are we not going to talk about this?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I mean, that was a topic that came up during COVID as well. Because with COVID, with wide open borders, people were able to come in and they weren't necessarily getting screened for COVID. And you're talking about, once again, a deadly disease. And so, yeah, that if it doesn't fit the dynamic or if it doesn't fit the narrative, people kind of adjust or ignore it. And so politicization around all of this has gotten terrible. And I think it's I don't know if it's going to get worse. I'm concerned about how bad it's gotten under this new administration. What I do see, though, is a pivot of academics that used to be in this corner that are now starting to go, well, maybe I need to listen to more science. So maybe there is some hope. There's a silver lining to this, in that, academics have been very, very pro the mRNA vaccine, but they've been very, very also involved in the mint cookie kind of trace exposure discussion. And so I think that hopefully this kind of their concern will make them pivot back to the middle. I don't think that they expected that you would have a measles outbreak after COVID. I think they've talked about this before, that how medicine became Monsanto, COVID-19, and pitfalls in scientific communication. And I think this is exactly what is the fallout from not communicating well, and then picking a side and selectively choosing what science you believe in rather than navigating the truth. The mRNA vaccine is truly a miracle. And Operation Warp Speed was truly a incredible opportunity for making the pharmaceutical industry and government and academia all work together to achieve an incredible goal. And they did it efficiently, but because it was done under the wrong administration, it got sidelined, and it created a whole bunch of doubt about the mRNA vaccines, and that has the potential to really undermine some good science that could be directed at treating cancer and in other therapies, because it's a game changer. It really is. Unfortunately, because people got so political about it, they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and then the backlash happens, right? And so that's where we are.
That's a great transition into this last story here. This is from Bloomberg, originally called "The Anti-Vax Culture War on mRNA Just Got Worse." This is by Lisa Jarvis. This time, the government, by cutting NIH funding for research, is leading the charge. This story is, I agree. Well, I don't agree with that. I agree in principle with most of the content in this article, because what she's saying is you have RFK, you have people running the NIH now who are going to promote skepticism about the mRNA vaccines. And I know. And that's bad. We should be disappointed, because there's some cancer vaccines in development that are enormous, that are going to make a big difference. But maybe start, and I'll turn it over to you because of my co-pilot here. Maybe you can talk about, you already started to, but maybe some of the things that were happening early in mid 2020 when people were throwing shade. I think the kids still use that phrase. They were criticizing these vaccines for political reasons. And then within a year, and I have some examples I want to quote in a second, within a year they were saying these are great vaccines, you got to take them. In fact, we'll force you. So,
yep.
So talk about that.
So in 2020 was really just a incredible time. Deadly pandemic. Doctors at the bedside taking care of patients who were just dying right, left, and center. They were trying to throw everything that they could. They were being exposed to this disease. They didn't know how lethal it was at first. And then, doctors died. Some nurses died. People didn't have enough PPE and things like that. So there was this huge, real fear about this deadly disease. And so, and then there was all sorts of mixed messaging about the disease as well. First of all, in order to preserve the availability of masks for doctors, the initial message was you don't need to mask, and then all of a sudden you needed to triple mask, and you were immoral if you didn't. So that started off precipitated the whole kind of questioning that people had. Then you had messaging that you can't go to church, you can't be at your loved one's bedside because we're really scared of people getting sick. Just lock down just for a couple of weeks to flatten the curve. All of that messaging, and then it went on and on and on and on. And before you know it, when people are rioting, there's a whole different message saying, "Oh well, this is a civil rights issue, and therefore the virus can wait while there's a riot." So that messaging really upset people who lost their businesses. People got very upset when their kids were kept out of school for 2 years, and felt like they were put back there. So in that setting, you had the vaccines show up. And the vaccines for the physicians who were actually taking care of very sick people were nothing short of miraculous. They were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. This is going to put an end to this epidemic." Everybody was running out and getting vaccines and taking selfies and all of that kind of stuff. Fast forward a little bit, they didn't want to, well, not even fast forward. As the vaccines were coming onto the market, the Kamala Harris and many people said that this has been too rushed. And many people on the left, many politicians, academics, things like that were like, this has been too rushed. We don't trust Operation Warp Speed. And it all had to do with the political climate. And then when the presidency shifted, the message shifted. Now, so you've got this big, huge setup where there's been a lot of mixed messaging, a lot of harm in terms of people losing jobs, kids being out of school and things like that. And now all of a sudden you've got this doubt that's been sown ahead of time. And then now you're supposed to actually listen to us and take the vaccine. That and there are very rare side effects like myocarditis, and I think that got picked up, and the regulatory agencies actually did their job trying to follow those claims and things like that. But those very rare side effects then got completely blown out of proportion when it came to whether or not the vaccine was beneficial. People couldn't see the difference between a very, very rare side effect and the prevention of literally millions of deaths. And I'm not trying to minimize those side effects. What happened was when people reported those and then got called anti-vaxxers, that poured gasoline on the fire. And unfortunately, I think it really did harm to this wonderful invention. And it's directly led to the way that the measles has been handled.
Let me give a couple examples since I teased those earlier. This is an article by Dr. Alex Berezow, microbiologist. He wrote this on November 10th, 2020. And he's talking about Andrew Cuomo, who was the governor of New York at the time, and Gavin Newsom, who is still the governor of California. So the vaccines at this point had just gone through the clinical trials. They weren't quite available yet, but they were being manufactured. And in the run-up to this release of these vaccines, Andrew Cuomo, you'll remember as the genius who sent a bunch of infected people into nursing homes.
Nursing homes, yeah.
Yeah. The epicenter of the pandemic in the United States was New York City, or one of them, I should say. He said the development of these COVID vaccines was, quote, bad news. Bad news. November 2020, the first successful coronavirus vaccine being engineered and manufactured in record time. Bad news. Not to be outdone, writes Dr. Berezow, a coalition of Western states led by California Governor Gavin Newsom said they're going to examine the vaccine data for themselves. Because those FDA scientists under the Trump administration, you can't trust those dunderheads. And so he said, as I've mentioned before on the show, right, the California Department of Public Health, which is something like a AAA baseball team compared to the Major League FDA. That's roughly what you're talking about here.
Right.
They don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise, because that's not what they do. Their job is to track disease outbreaks at the state level is often what they do. Okay, they're not equipped to review a brand new vaccine. Okay, so this is right before the vaccines come out. This is arguably the virus is at its most deadly stage.
Peak. Yes,
because you have the most vulnerable people still alive. Mm-hmm. And it's brand new to human populations. There's no immunity to it yet.
That's right. This virus. Yes, that's exactly right.
This is the worst time to do this. And then here we go. This is Gavin Newsom. Less than a year later, and you can read this. I wrote this for ACSH. It's called California Governor Mandates COVID Vaccines in Schools, Exempts Political Allies. He advocated, this is, the date of this story, October 21st, 2021. The first one, November 10th. So this is like almost a year, right? Like right on there. So he mandates the COVID shot for school-age children, whether you think that's a good thing or not, whatever, different topic. And he said the trigger for whether or not you were going to be required to get this shot was whether it was FDA authorized. So less than a year earlier, he's telling people, I don't trust the FDA to authorize this vaccine. A year later, well, the FDA authorized it, so it's safe and effective.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then he says vaccines are how we end this pandemic. Or that's what his office said when he was chastised about this. And the reason he was chastised is because he went to federal court to fight a mandate for the California Prison Guards Union because they didn't want to have their members vaccinated.
Or they wanted their members to have the choice.
Right. And his argument in court, if you read the court documents, my jaw dropped when I read this. The argument was, well, all the prisoners can vaccinate themselves, right? The best way to protect yourself from an infectious disease is to get a vaccine. So, the prison guards don't have to get vaccinated. And at the time, the court said, no, that's cruel and unusual punishment. These people are stuck in prison, so you can't expose them to a potentially lethal virus. And I think
Right.
later on when it was appealed, it got overturned. So the governor got away with this. And I'll stop talking after this. I'm sorry, Liza.
No, that's fine.
This blows my mind because one of the things in this Bloomberg story that the author is complaining about is that the NIH canceled a bunch of research that was looking into mRNA vaccine hesitancy.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you what, if you want to give me $500,000 in federal grant funding, I will reproduce all of this in scientific jargon, and I'll put it in a paper with footnotes, and then I'll submit it to Nature or wherever, and then you can work with that. You do not need studies to understand why so many people, especially on the right, are afraid of mRNA. This is
exactly
why.
right.
It's because
exactly
you told
why.
them. You
That's
told
exactly
them to be afraid. There you go. Your thoughts.
Yes, you told them to be afraid, and once again, you not only did you tell them to be afraid, you were inconsistent in your application of depending on the political group you were talking to. So it's you can't just say, oh, everyone needs to get this except for my friends. Because what are your friends special? If you're going to mandate a vaccine, it has to be mandated for everybody. If you're going to say, and then there are also situations under which it's okay to say no. So, like especially to the booster, right? I think that Paul Offit backs this up. I think that boys who are at higher risk of myocarditis, teenage boys, I think they're unlikely to get sick. We know that now. I don't know how much we knew exactly when, way back when, so I wouldn't have necessarily complained about boys getting a shot initially, because I think that that's a very rare side effect again. And it's protecting vulnerable people. But people who had questions or people who, wanted to know about myocarditis were absolutely painted as anti-vaxxers, and that's not the case.
Yeah. See, you're so much more thoughtful and measured than I am. I think these cuts have to continue. Like the science community just doesn't get this. They just outside of this podcast, to my knowledge, no one in science talks about this.
No, they don't.
Nobody openly criticizes Gavin Newsom or Andrew
Nope.
Cuomo.
Mm-mm.
And I'm not going to name names, but there were some scientists that went before Congress, and to their credit, this was before the clinical trials were completed. But they were warning people very sternly, you have to study these vaccines carefully because you can't release a vaccine that's not studied. That could be very, very serious. And as soon as the clinical trials were done, they said, okay, we're convinced now, right? But the average person doesn't understand that distinction. All they remember is you in front of Congress lecturing everyone about how slowly we have to take this so we get this right.
That's right.
And then
That's
they see afterwards that you were like, you got to get it, you got to get it, you got to get the booster, you got to get the next boost. You know what I mean? You guys
So
don't...
studying vaccine hesitancy is a once again, it's like beating a dead horse. You know why people are hesitant, and because the conditions were created for that to happen, and it's just not a good expenditure. Now, on the other side, I think there's a lot of good stuff that's being cut. And I've said this before. My good friends, are working on really important advances in cancer and things like that, that I hate to see any of that stuff get cut. I hate to see generations of scientists not being able to learn molecular biology because of this kind of stuff. Training grants and stuff like that being cut. I hate to see mRNA go by the wayside as a tool for combating cancer and things like that. But there's a lot of money that is being wasted, and vaccine hesitancy, it's absolutely 100% clear why we have a measles outbreak. And the conditions were created often by the scientific community in cahoots with the politicians around the issue.
Yeah. And let me be clear. RFK bears 100% of the responsibility for the lies he's told about vaccines over the years.
And those kids who died.
Yes. The blood is on his hands. If a parent listens to him, something he said, like when he was talking about Samoa and all this stuff, if they listen to him and their kids died, that is 100% his fault. I'm not excusing what he did or what Andrew Wakefield did or what Del Bigtree does. These people are cynical, they're disingenuous, and they're wrong, and it costs people's lives. But the point that everyone on our team and our tribe overlooks is that they were platformed by the media. The
Yes.
Lancet published Wakefield's study and refused to
Yes.
retract it for over a decade. Okay?
Yes.
You have to self-police because
Yes.
Kennedy doesn't get to HHS secretary. What an incredible statement.
Isn't that unbelievable?
He does not get propelled to that level of power without the opposition, without the double standards and the hypocrisy that we saw throughout the pandemic, because you turned him into the martyr. Because he could say, look, they locked you in your homes. And they didn't follow their rules. They were cheating on their wives with their girlfriends while they told you that a bunch of people were going to die before the month was out.
Yep. Yeah, it was a catastrophe for scientific communication, and good scientists then are getting caught in the the current, and it's really frustrating to watch that. Really frustrating to watch that, and I think that and good scientists don't want to be accused of having been complicit in some capacity or another. They get frustrated hearing this side because they think that we think that they just stood by the wayside and that all the scientists were doing this. No, a lot of doctors were working their tails off trying their best to save people. Scientists were working on vaccines and a whole bunch of other technologies to try to improve the care of this stuff. So there were people, very good people, working on this pandemic, looking for the best outcome possible. But the loudest and most peripheral voices took over, and then the people who did the most damage were the people who promoted one policy and then were hypocritical, did their own thing. Jay Varma, and this is even after the fact. This was only recently discovered, right? That is such a blow to scientific credibility and to the credibility of institutions.
He went to sex parties and did ecstasy with his pediatrician wife while he was locking down the rest of New York City and enforcing a vaccine mandate.
Yeah, and people don't like to hear that because and scientists who are working on different things don't like to hear that. They're like, we weren't doing that.
Yeah.
No, no, you weren't. You were really working hard and you were doing the very best you could given terrible circumstances. But this kind of thing destroys. This is how RFK Jr. winds up in the position he's in.
Yeah. And one thing I've heard, there's one doctor on YouTube, he's a great communicator. He's very popular. Dr. Mike, I think. I don't know his name. I've watched some of his videos. He did there's a YouTube channel where they bring like one person together and they're sitting in a circle of 20 people and this one person debates all these 20 people. And they
I've seen those. Yeah.
So they had one of these, I forget what the channel's called. Someone will know. That he did one with a bunch of people who were skeptical of vaccines for one reason or another. And somebody brought this up to him and he said, and I understand where he's coming from. He said, look, he was a hypocrite and what he did was wrong, but is it possible that his advice was still correct, even if he wasn't following it?
And that's probably the best way to deal with that.
That's true, but I think it misses the thrust of the complaint. The complaint is this guy obviously does not feel that his own safety was threatened because he was going out and having sex with strangers in the middle of a pandemic, right? Right. So if his advice was good, he would have followed it. And I think that's what people were overlooking.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that's probably the only answer that you can give to that. That's a reasonable answer in terms of his response, right? Right. But clearly he wasn't believing what he was saying, because if he thought he was going to die, he wouldn't do it.
Right.
Right. So.
But you got to stay home. You got to stay home unless you're going to bring me nachos. Then you're essential, right? Right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This has just been such a fiasco for science.
Yeah. So anyways, I don't want to belabor the point. I sound like a broken record because no one else will talk about this, and it drives me up the wall. I can tell you what all of those NIH studies would have found. They would have found that right-wing partisanship is driving people to deny vaccines. That's all you're allowed to say. That's it. That's the answer, because evolution denial and climate change denial and ExxonMobil, and it's just garbage. I'm over it. Final thing. About a decade ago, when I started writing about science, I made a case, borrowing from way smarter people, that we need to privatize all science. We need to stop government funding of science. I'm back there. I really am. I know that's heresy. I'm just so done with it, right? You go convince somebody to give you their money. Stop taking mine by proxy and studying microplastics in chewing gum and whatever. If your vaccine's good and there's a lot of good development, then go to a pharma company and do it.
And do it. That's
Because
exactly
that's where
right.
most of the money comes from anyway. A large portion of the research that's done in academia, it's ultimately funded and commercialized by pharma. So let's just go the extra 25%. I'm just over this. I don't care anymore. I'm just done with it. It's just insane. Transgender children? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's so few scientists are willing to talk about it because that's a third rail. And you know what's going to be a third rail is 50 years from now, people are going to look back and say, "You did this. How did so many people get on this bandwagon?" And that's once again, this is you got to tell the truth, and this is not good medicine. Not good medicine. It's not a human rights issue. Nobody's calling for harming trans people or anything like that. What they are trying to do is protect children and women.
Crazy.
Yep.
It is crazy. You're going to lecture me about evolution denial and you're going to tell me sex is a spectrum? Get out of here. Get out of here with that. I don't want to hear it, nature. I'm over you. No, shut it down. Shut it down.
Right.
Incidentally, if you want to learn more about privatizing science, which is my new thing now, I'm going back to it. I'm done with it. Terence Keeley is a biochemist. He wrote a book, massive book, Economic Laws of Scientific Research, demolishes the case for publicly funded science. Everything you think about it is wrong. It's wrong. Go read that book.
I'm going to read it.
I wrote an article in 2012 or so called Privatize Science Funding, something like that. You can find it. I think it's on Mike.com or for. Anyways.
I'll look for it.
I'm getting all hyped up. All right. We'll go into the weekend. I'll calm down. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you for tolerating my rants.
This was a fiery episode.
Yes. Liza's here to bring the rational, good cop side of the equation.
I don't know how much I did at that.
Oh, well. Okay. Thank you. Follow us on X at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at CamJ English. Our spaces every Friday, 11 a.m. Central Time. We talk about all kinds of topics. You're welcome to come share your opinion. Just don't be too much of a jerk. Don't call anyone a slave to pharma.
That's right. If you're nice, we'll talk to you.
Yes, indeed. All right. We'll be back next week. Thank you as always. See you then.
Take care. Bye-bye.